The clock on the wall showed 6:30 p.m., and the Grand Central Hotel was buzzing with its usual evening rush. People moved in all directions across the polished marble floor, their footsteps creating a gentle echo that mixed with dozens of conversations. Happening at once, near the main entrance, a businessman in a wrinkled suit dragged his rolling suitcase toward the reception desk, checking his phone every few seconds. Behind him, a young mother tried to keep her twin boys from running around, while her husband handled the check-in process. The boys kept pointing at the huge chandelier hanging from the ceiling, their eyes wide with wonder. At the front desk, 3 receptionists worked quickly to help the steady stream of guests. Their fingers moved fast across computer keyboards as they printed room keys and explained hotel services. The phone rang constantly, and each time someone answered with the same cheerful voice, "Grand Central Hotel, how may I help you?" The lobby was designed to impress. Tall columns stretched up to a ceiling painted with gold details, and expensive artwork hung on the walls. Soft leather chairs were arranged in small groups around glass tables, where some guests sat reading newspapers or chatting quietly. The air smelled faintly of fresh flowers from the large arrangements placed throughout the space. In one corner of the lobby, away from the main traffic flow, sat a beautiful black grand piano. Its surface was so shiny you could see your reflection in it, and the bench was positioned perfectly in front of the keys. But tonight, like most nights for the past few weeks, it sat silent and unused. The piano had a story of its own. For years, an elderly man named Professor Williams had played there every evening from 7 to 9 p.m. Guests would often gather around to listen to his gentle melodies while they enjoyed drinks from the lobby bar. Children would sit on the floor nearby, mesmerized by the way his fingers danced across the keys. Even the hotel staff would slow down their work just to listen for a few moments, but Professor Williams had retired last month and moved to Florida to be closer to his grandchildren. The hotel management had been looking for a replacement, but finding someone with the right skill and personality wasn't easy. They had interviewed several musicians, but none of them felt quite right for the elegant yet welcoming atmosphere. They wanted to maintain so the piano waited like a sleeping giant in its corner while life continued around it. Near the elevator bank, David finished wiping down the last of the brass buttons and stepped back to admire his work. He had been working at the Grand Central Hotel for almost 2 years now, starting right after he graduated from high school. His official title was maintenance assistant, which meant he did a little bit of everything: cleaning, minor repairs, helping with luggage when the bellhops were busy, and making sure all the public areas looked perfect. David was 20 years old, with sandy brown hair that he kept neatly combed and a friendly smile that made guests feel welcome. He wore the standard hotel uniform, navy blue pants, a white shirt, and a name tag that simply said, David Maintenance. His shoes were always polished, and his shirt was always pressed, because he took pride in representing the hotel well. Most people who saw David throughout the day probably thought of him as just another hotel employee doing his job. They didn't know that he had been playing piano since he was 8 years old, teaching himself from library books and online videos. They didn't know that he could play everything from classical pieces to modern pop songs, or that music was his greatest passion in life. David's family didn't have much money when he was growing up. His mom worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices at night and stocking shelves at a grocery store during the day. His dad had left when David was 12, and they rarely heard from him. There was never enough money for piano lessons, let alone a piano of their own, but David was determined. He would walk to the public library after school every day and use their old computer to watch piano tutorials on YouTube. He printed out sheet music for free songs and studied them until the pages were worn soft from handling. When the library got a small electric keyboard for their children's programs, David would volunteer to help set up events just so he could practice for a few minutes on the instrument. By the time he was 16, David could play better than many people who had taken lessons for years. He had a natural ear for music and an ability to feel the emotion behind every note. But he kept this talent mostly to himself. His friends at school knew he liked music, but they had no idea how skilled he really was. When David started working at the Grand Central Hotel, he was immediately drawn to the piano in the lobby. During his breaks, he would sometimes sit on one of the nearby chairs and listen to Professor Williams play. The old man's style was classical and refined, and David found himself learning just by watching his hand positions and the way he approached different pieces. A few times, Professor Williams had noticed David listening and had smiled and nodded at him. Once, during a particularly slow evening, the professor had even called David over and asked if he played any instruments. David had shyly admitted that he knew a little piano, and Professor Williams had encouraged him to keep practicing. Music is one of the few things in life that gets better the more you share it, the old man had said. Now, as David finished his evening tasks, he found his eyes drifting toward the silent piano once again. The lobby was still busy, but in a different way than earlier. The business travelers had mostly checked in and gone to their rooms or out to dinner. The families with children had settled in for the night. The remaining people in the lobby were relaxed, reading books, having quiet conversations, or simply enjoying the elegant atmosphere. David walked slowly toward the piano, pretending to check the nearby plants for dust. His heart was beating a little faster than usual. For weeks, he had been thinking about what it would be like to sit at that bench and play. He had imagined his fingers on those keys, wondered how the sound would carry through the high-ceilinged lobby. The truth was, David had been feeling restless lately. Working at the hotel was fine, and he was grateful to have a steady job, but he dreamed of something more. He dreamed of music filling his life in a bigger way. Sometimes, lying in bed at night in the small apartment he shared with his mom, he would imagine himself playing piano for people who really wanted to listen, but those seemed like impossible dreams for someone in his position. He didn't have a college degree or formal training. He didn't have connections in the music world, or money to pursue his dreams properly. He was just a maintenance worker who happened to love playing piano. Still, as he stood near the silent instrument, David felt something stirring inside him. Maybe it was the way the soft lobby lighting reflected off the piano's polished surface. Maybe it was the memory of Professor Williams encouraging him to share his music. Or maybe it was simply the end of a long day and the desire to do something that would feed his soul instead of just paying his bills. David glanced around the lobby one more time. His shift was officially over, and he had already completed all his assigned tasks. No one was paying particular attention to him or the piano. For just a moment, he allowed himself to imagine sitting down at that bench and letting his fingers find the keys he knew so well in his mind. What would happen if he actually did it? David's hands felt sweaty as he stood there, staring at the piano bench. His heart was racing, and he could hear it thumping in his ears over the quiet conversations happening around the lobby. He had been thinking about this moment for weeks, but now that he was actually here, doubts started creeping in. What if someone told him to stop? What if he wasn't allowed to touch the hotel's expensive piano? What if he made a fool of himself in front of all these important guests? His uniform suddenly felt too tight, and he was very aware that he looked like exactly what he was, a young maintenance worker, who probably didn't belong anywhere near such a beautiful instrument. But something deep inside him kept pulling him forward. It was like a voice whispering that this might be his only chance. When would he ever get to play a piano this nice again? The electric keyboard at the library couldn't even compare to this gorgeous grand piano. This was the kind of instrument that real musicians played, the kind he had only dreamed about touching. David looked around the lobby one more time. Most people were busy with their own conversations or activities. A couple near the window was looking at restaurant menus, trying to decide where to go for dinner. An older woman was reading a book in one of the leather chairs, occasionally sipping from a cup of tea. Two businessmen were shaking hands near the elevators, apparently finishing up some kind of meeting. Nobody was paying attention to him or the piano area. This was probably the best chance he would get. Taking a deep breath, David walked the final few steps to the piano bench. His legs felt shaky, like they might give out at any moment. He had imagined this moment so many times. But actually being here felt completely different. Everything seemed more real, more scary, but also more exciting. He sat down slowly on the leather bench, trying to act casual, like he belonged there. The bench was the perfect height, and he could tell it had been adjusted by someone who really knew pianos. Professor Williams had probably spent hours sitting in this exact spot, sharing his music with everyone who passed by. David's hands hovered over the keys, not quite touching them yet. The piano keys were perfectly clean and white, except for the black keys that seemed to shine under the lobby lights. He could see his own reflection in the polished wood above the keys. His face looked nervous but determined. For a moment he just sat there, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about playing piano. This was about stepping out of the safe, predictable world he had built for himself. It was about taking a risk, even a small one, to do something that mattered to him. His mind went back to all those afternoons at the library, watching YouTube videos over and over until he understood how to make his fingers move the right way. He remembered the first time he had successfully played a simple song all the way through without making a mistake. He was 14 then, and he had felt like he could conquer the world. He thought about his mom, who worked so hard every day but still found time to listen when he hummed melodies around their apartment. She had always told him that he had a gift, even though they couldn't afford to develop it properly. Someday, she would say, you'll find a way to share your music with the world. Maybe today was that someday, even if it was just in a small way. David finally let his fingers touch the keys, very gently at first. They felt smooth and cool under his fingertips. The piano was perfectly tuned. He could tell just from the light touch. This was going to sound beautiful, whatever he decided to play, but what should he play? He knew dozens of songs by heart, from classical pieces he had learned from sheet music to popular songs he had figured out by ear. He wanted something that would sound good in this elegant lobby, something that matched the sophisticated atmosphere, but also showed what he could really do. He decided on Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. It was one of the first classical pieces he had learned completely, and he knew it so well that he could play it even when he was nervous. The melody was beautiful and romantic, perfect for an evening setting like this. It wasn't too complicated or showy, but it would definitely demonstrate that he knew what he was doing. David positioned his hands over the keys in the starting position. His fingers remembered exactly where to go, even though it had been a few weeks since he had practiced this piece. That was one of the good things about learning music by heart. It stayed with you. Like riding a bicycle, he was about to start playing when a new wave of anxiety hit him. What if he made mistakes? What if people laughed at him? What if hotel security came over and told him to leave? What if he got in trouble with his boss and lost his job? All these thoughts raced through his mind in just a few seconds. He could feel his palms getting sweaty again, and his breathing was getting faster. This was harder than he had expected it to be. Playing alone in his apartment or humming along to songs on his phone was one thing, but actually performing in front of people, even strangers who weren't really paying attention, felt huge and scary. But then David remembered something Professor Williams had said during one of their brief conversations. The old man had been telling him about his early days as a professional musician, and he had mentioned that the fear never really goes away completely. The trick, he had said, is to let the music be bigger than the fear. When you really love what you're playing, everything else becomes background noise. David closed his eyes for just a moment and tried to feel the music instead of the fear. He thought about the beautiful melody of the Nocturne, the way it started soft and gentle, then built to something more emotional before settling back into peaceful calm. He thought about how Chopin must have felt when he wrote this piece, probably sitting at his own piano late at night, letting his feelings flow through his fingers onto the keys. When David opened his eyes, he felt a little calmer. The lobby was still busy around him, but it didn't feel as overwhelming now. He was just a young man who loved music, sitting at a piano, about to share something beautiful with the world. It didn't have to be more complicated than that. Very slowly, David pressed down on the first key of the Nocturne. The note rang out, clear and pure, floating up toward the high ceiling and mixing with the gentle sounds of the evening lobby. It was just one note, but it was the beginning of everything. He pressed the second key, then the third, and suddenly his fingers were moving in the familiar pattern he had practiced hundreds of times. The opening phrase of the nocturne began to fill the space around him, and David felt something shift inside his chest. The fear was still there, but it was getting smaller with each note he played. The music was taking over, just like Professor Williams had said it would, and for the first time in a long time, David felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. As David's fingers began moving across the keys, something magical started happening. The first few notes of Chopin's Nocturne floated through the lobby like gentle raindrops, soft and delicate. His left hand found the deep bass notes that would support the melody, while his right hand began the hauntingly beautiful opening phrase that had captured his heart years ago when he first heard it. At first, David was very aware of everything around him. He could hear the click of high heels on marble floors, the ding of elevator doors opening and closing, and the murmur of conversations throughout the lobby. His shoulders were tense, and he kept glancing around nervously between phrases, expecting someone to come over and tell him to stop. But as he continued playing, something began to change. The familiar melody started working its way into his soul, just like it always did when he played alone in his apartment. His shoulders began to relax, and his breathing became deeper and more natural. The muscle memory in his fingers took over, and he found himself playing with more confidence than he had felt. Just moments before, the piano itself seemed to respond to his touch. Unlike the small electric keyboard at the library, this grand piano had real weight behind each key. When he pressed gently, the sound was soft and intimate. When he added more pressure, the notes sang out with rich, full tone that filled the entire space. He could feel the vibrations through the bench, through his whole body, connecting him to the instrument in a way he had never experienced before. About 30 seconds into the piece, David realized he had stopped thinking about the people around him. The music was taking him to that special place in his mind where nothing existed except melody, harmony, and rhythm. His fingers seemed to know exactly where to go without any conscious effort from him. This was the feeling he lived for, the reason he had spent countless hours teaching himself to play. The nocturne's melody began to build, moving from the gentle opening into slightly more complex passages. David's right hand danced across the higher keys while his left hand provided the steady, supportive foundation below. He had always loved this particular piece because it told a story without words. It started peaceful and dreamy, like someone remembering a beautiful moment from long ago. As the music flowed from the piano, something interesting began happening in the lobby around him. The sound wasn't loud or demanding attention, but it had a quality that made people stop and listen, even if they didn't realize they were doing it at first. Near the front desk, one of the receptionists looked up from her computer screen. She had been typing quickly, trying to finish some paperwork before her shift ended, but the beautiful melody made her fingers pause over the keyboard. She tilted her head slightly, trying to figure out where the music was coming from. When she spotted David at the piano, her eyebrows raised in surprise. She had seen him around the hotel many times, always polite and hardworking, but she had no idea he could play like this. At a table near the window, a young couple had been having a serious conversation about their relationship. They were facing some difficult decisions about their future together, and the talk had been tense and emotional. But as the piano music reached their ears, both of them gradually stopped talking. The woman looked toward the piano first, and then the man followed her gaze. Without saying anything, they both seemed to relax a little. The music created a peaceful atmosphere that made their problems feel less overwhelming, at least for the moment. An elderly gentleman who had been reading his newspaper in one of the leather chairs slowly lowered the pages and looked over his reading glasses toward the piano. He was a retired music teacher who had spent 40 years helping children learn to play various instruments. His trained ear immediately recognized not just the technical skill in David's playing, but something deeper, real musical understanding, and genuine emotion. This young man wasn't just hitting the right notes. He was actually making music. David, meanwhile, was completely lost in the piece. He had reached the section where the melody becomes more passionate and expressive. His whole body was moving slightly with the rhythm, and his face showed the concentration and joy of someone doing exactly what they were meant to do. The nervousness from earlier had melted away completely, replaced by pure love for the music. He was creating. The nocturne required both hands to work together in complex ways, with the melody jumping between different fingers while maintaining a smooth, connected sound. David's years of self-teaching had prepared him well for this challenge. He had spent hours practicing slowly, making sure every note was clean and every phrase had the right shape and feeling. As he played, David began to notice that the usual lobby sounds seemed quieter than before. He wasn't sure if it was his imagination, or if people were actually making less noise, but the piano seemed to be the main sound filling the space now. This realization gave him an extra boost of confidence, and he began playing with even more expression and freedom. The piece moved into a section that had always been David's favorite, a moment where the melody climbs higher and becomes more urgent, like someone's heart beating faster with emotion. His right hand moved gracefully up the keyboard while his left hand continued the steady accompaniment pattern. The sound filled every corner of the lobby, bouncing off the high ceiling and marble walls to create a rich, enveloping musical experience. A little girl who had been playing with toys near her parents looked up when she heard the music. She couldn't understand what made it special, but something about the sound made her want to listen. She tugged on her mother's sleeve and pointed toward the piano. Her mother, who had been checking emails on her phone, followed her daughter's pointing finger and was surprised to see a hotel employee playing such beautiful music. The hotel's evening manager, who had been walking through the lobby on his regular rounds, stopped in his tracks when he heard the piano. He knew that Professor Williams had retired, and he thought the piano had been silent for weeks. Curious about who might be playing, he moved closer to get a better view. Being careful not to disturb the performance, David was now about 2/3 of the way through the nocturne, approaching the section where the melody becomes more reflective and peaceful again. This was always the part that moved him most deeply. After all the passion and intensity of the middle section, Chopin brought the piece back to the gentle, dreamy quality of the beginning, but with a sense of completion and satisfaction. As his fingers moved through these final phrases, David felt a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the music itself, for having learned to play, for this unexpected opportunity to share his gift with others, and for this moment of pure joy in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday evening. He had no idea that around him, the entire atmosphere of the lobby was changing. Conversations were getting quieter, people were moving more slowly, and a growing number of eyes were turning toward the piano corner, where a young maintenance worker was creating something beautiful and unexpected. The music was doing what music does best, bringing people together in the shared moment of wonder, even when they didn't realize it was happening. As David moved into the final section of the nocturne, something extraordinary was happening throughout the Grand Central Hotel lobby. What had started as background music was now commanding the attention of nearly everyone in the space. The transformation was so gradual that most people didn't even realize they had stopped what they were doing to listen. The young couple who had been discussing their relationship problems found themselves holding hands across their table, something they hadn't done in weeks. The music seemed to remind them of why they had fallen in love in the first place. The woman had tears in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the pure beauty of what she was hearing. Her boyfriend squeezed her hand gently, and for the first time that evening, they smiled at each other. At the reception desk, all 3 staff members had stopped working entirely. The phones were still ringing, but they let them go to voicemail. Guests waiting to check in didn't seem to mind the delay. They too were caught up in the magic of the moment. One businessman who had been tapping his foot impatiently just minutes before was now standing perfectly still, his briefcase forgotten at his feet, completely absorbed in the music. The elderly gentleman who had been reading his newspaper had folded it neatly and placed it on his lap. As a retired music teacher, he recognized exceptional talent when he heard it. But this was more than just technical skill. This young man was playing with the kind of emotional depth that usually took years of professional training to develop. He found himself wondering about David's background, how he had learned to play with such feeling and precision near the elevator bank. A group of teenagers who had been laughing loudly while waiting for their parents gradually became quiet. At first they had barely noticed the piano music, but as it continued, something about it drew them in. One of the girls pulled out her phone, not to scroll through social media like usual, but to record a few seconds of the performance. She had never heard live classical music before, and she was surprised by how much it affected her. The little girl who had pointed out the music to her mother was now sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring at David with wide, fascinated eyes. Her mother had put away her phone completely and was stroking her daughter's hair while they listened together. This was one of those rare moments when the busy world seemed to slow down, allowing them to simply be present and enjoy something beautiful happening right in front of them. David, still lost in his music, had no idea about the growing audience around him. He was approaching the ending of the nocturne, where Chopin brings all the emotions together in a few final, perfect phrases. His fingers moved with complete confidence now, every note exactly where it needed to be. The months and years of practice. In his small apartment, the countless hours watching tutorial videos, the dedication to learning despite having no formal lessons, it all came together in this moment. The hotel's evening manager had moved closer to the piano, though he stayed at a respectful distance. He was trying to process what he was witnessing. In his 15 years of working in hospitality, he had never seen anything quite like this. The entire lobby had transformed from a busy transit space into something resembling a concert hall. And it was all because of one of their own maintenance staff members, a young man he had barely noticed before tonight. A group of business colleagues, who had been having drinks at the lobby bar, found themselves abandoning their conversation about quarterly reports and profit margins. Instead, they were leaning back in their chairs, drinks forgotten, letting the music wash over them. One of them, a woman who hadn't touched a piano since high school, felt an unexpected longing to play again. The music reminded her of dreams she had put aside years ago, in favor of a more practical career. Even the hotel's security guard, who was used to scanning the lobby for potential problems, had stopped his usual patrol route. He stood near one of the marble columns, his radio quiet on his belt, simply listening. He had worked night shifts for years and was accustomed to the predictable rhythms of hotel life, but this was something completely different and wonderful. As David played the final ascending phrase of the nocturne, a hush fell over the entire lobby that was almost magical. It was as if everyone collectively held their breath, not wanting to miss a single note of the conclusion. The melody climbed gracefully higher, each note clear and pure, before settling into the gentle, peaceful ending that Chopin had crafted so perfectly. When David finally played the last soft chord and lifted his hands from the keys, the silence that followed was profound. For several seconds, nobody moved or spoke. The moment felt too precious to break with ordinary sounds. People looked around at each other with expressions of wonder and surprise, as if they had all shared something special without planning it. Slowly, one person began to clap. It was the elderly gentleman with the newspaper, who had stood up from his chair and was applauding with genuine appreciation. His clapping seemed to wake everyone else from their trance, and suddenly the entire lobby erupted in warm, heartfelt applause. David looked up from the piano keys, startled and confused. For the first time since he had started playing, he became fully aware of his surroundings again. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. There were people everywhere, all looking at him, all clapping. The reception staff, the guests, the teenagers, the business people, the families, everyone had stopped what they were doing to listen to his music. His face turned red with embarrassment and surprise. He had been so absorbed in playing that he hadn't noticed the growing audience. Now, seeing all these people applauding him, he felt overwhelmed. Part of him wanted to run away and hide, but another part felt a warm glow of pride and accomplishment that he had never experienced before. The applause continued for what felt like forever to David, though it was probably only about 30 seconds. People were smiling at him, some giving him thumbs up, others nodding their approval. The little girl near the front clapped her hands excitedly and called out, "Play more!" In her sweet, high voice, David stood up from the piano bench slowly, not sure what to do or say. He had never performed for an audience before, never experienced anything like this reaction to his music. His legs felt shaky again, but this time it was from excitement rather than nervousness. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice barely loud enough for the people closest to him to hear. He wasn't sure if he should bow or wave or just walk away. Everything about this situation was new and overwhelming, but also incredibly wonderful. The applause began to fade, but people were still looking at him with curiosity and appreciation. Some were whispering to each other, probably wondering who he was and where he had learned to play like that. The evening manager was approaching, and David wondered if he was about to get in trouble for using the piano without permission, but the expression on the manager's face wasn't angry or disapproving. Instead, he looked amazed and pleased, like someone who had just witnessed something truly special in his hotel. While everyone in the lobby had been captivated by David's performance, there was one person who had been watching and listening from the very beginning, though nobody had noticed him. Tucked away in a corner armchair, partially hidden behind a large potted plant and a marble column, sat an elderly man who had arrived at the hotel almost an hour earlier. Professor Volkov was 73 years old, with silver white hair that was still thick and wavy and deep blue eyes that seemed to notice everything around him. He wore an expensive but understated dark suit, and his hands showed the long, elegant fingers of someone who had spent decades at piano keyboards. To most people walking by, he probably looked like just another well-dressed hotel guest, perhaps a businessman or retired executive enjoying a quiet evening. But Professor Volkov was far from ordinary. He was one of the most respected classical musicians in the world, a pianist and conductor who had performed in the greatest concert halls from New York to Vienna to Tokyo. His recordings had won multiple Grammy Awards, and music students around the globe studied his interpretations of the great classical masterpieces. He had conducted some of the world's finest orchestras, and had taught master classes at the most prestigious music schools. Tonight, he was in town for a very special event. Tomorrow evening, he would be conducting the city's symphony orchestra in a gala performance that had been sold out for months. The concert was a fundraiser for the local music education program, a cause that was very close to his heart. He believed deeply that music should be accessible to everyone, not just those who could afford expensive lessons and instruments. Professor Volkov had arrived early for his dinner meeting with the symphony's board of directors. The restaurant was just across the street from the hotel, and he had decided to wait in the comfortable lobby rather than standing outside. He had chosen the corner chair specifically because it offered a good view of the entire space while keeping him relatively private. After decades of public performances, he sometimes enjoyed just sitting quietly and observing the world around him. When David first sat down at the piano, Professor Volkov had looked up from the evening newspaper he had been reading. His first thought was that perhaps the hotel had hired a new pianist to replace the elderly gentleman who used to play there. He had heard Professor Williams perform several times during previous visits to the hotel, and while the old man was competent, his playing had been pleasant but not particularly inspiring. But as soon as David began the opening notes of the Chopin Nocturne, Professor Volkov knew he was hearing something completely different. His trained ear immediately picked up on the subtle nuances in David's touch, the way he shaped each phrase with genuine musical understanding. This wasn't just someone who had memorized the notes. This was a musician who truly understood what Chopin was trying to express. Professor Volkov set his newspaper aside completely and leaned forward in his chair, listening with the intensity he usually reserved for auditions at the conservatory. He watched David's hand position, his posture, the way his body moved with the music. Everything about the young man's technique suggested someone who had developed his skills through pure dedication and natural musical instinct rather than formal training. As the performance continued, Professor Volkov found himself more and more impressed. The technical execution was nearly flawless. But what really captured his attention was the emotional depth in David's playing. The young man wasn't just playing the notes correctly, he was telling a story, communicating the longing and beauty that made Chopin's music immortal. Professor Volkov had heard this particular nocturne performed hundreds of times by students, colleagues, and professional musicians. He had even recorded it himself early in his career. But there was something special about David's interpretation, a freshness and sincerity that reminded him why he had fallen in love with music in the first place, when the middle section of the nocturne became more passionate and intense. Professor Volkov noticed how David's entire being seemed to merge with the music. The young man's face showed complete concentration and joy, the expression of someone who was exactly where he belonged. It reminded Professor Volkov of his own early days as a student, when he would practice for hours not because he had to, but because he couldn't imagine doing anything else. As he watched the growing audience around the piano, Professor Volkov felt a familiar warmth in his chest. This was what music was supposed to do: bring people together, create moments of shared beauty and wonder. He had seen it happen in concert halls around the world, but there was something especially magical about witnessing it in this unexpected setting. With this unlikely performer, the professor began to think about David's background and training. Clearly, the young man had extraordinary natural talent, but his technique suggested he was largely self-taught. There were small things, tiny details in his hand position and pedaling that showed he had developed his skills outside of traditional classical training. Yet somehow, he had managed to achieve a level of musical expression that many formally trained pianists never reached. Professor Volkov had spent his entire career looking for young musicians with this kind of rare combination of technical skill and genuine musical soul. He had taught at some of the world's most prestigious music schools, always searching for students who had that special spark that couldn't be taught, only nurtured and developed. As David approached the final section of the nocturne, Professor Volkov found himself holding his breath. These last phrases were some of the most beautiful and challenging in all of piano literature, requiring both technical precision and deep emotional understanding. He watched as David's fingers moved through the delicate passages with complete confidence and perfect musical timing. When the final chord faded away and the lobby erupted in applause, Professor Volkov remained seated, though his heart was beating faster than usual. He had just witnessed something truly extraordinary, a young man with possibly world-class talent performing in a hotel lobby while wearing a maintenance uniform. It was the kind of discovery that happened maybe once in a lifetime, if at all. The professor watched as David stood up from the piano bench, clearly overwhelmed by the audience's reaction. The young man's face showed a mixture of embarrassment, surprise, and joy that was absolutely genuine. There was no false modesty or calculated performance, just a pure, human reaction to having shared something beautiful with others. Professor Volkov noticed the hotel manager approaching David, and he wondered what would happen next. Would the young man get in trouble for playing the hotel's piano? Would anyone recognize the extraordinary gift they had just witnessed? Or would this moment simply fade away, forgotten by tomorrow morning? The professor made a decision. He couldn't let this opportunity pass by. In his 73 years, he had learned to recognize when fate presented something special. And this was definitely one of those moments. He had connections throughout the music world, resources and knowledge that could change a talented young person's life forever. But first, he needed to approach this carefully. David was clearly not a professional musician, and Professor Volkov didn't want to overwhelm him or make promises he couldn't keep. He would need to learn more about the young man's background, his dreams, and his willingness to work hard for his musical development. Professor Volkov stood up slowly from his chair, smoothing his suit jacket and preparing to walk over to the piano area. His dinner meeting could wait. This was far more important than any business discussion. He was about to potentially change two lives forever, David's and his own, because discovering and nurturing true talent was what gave his own life meaning. As he began walking toward the piano, Professor Volkov felt the same excitement he had experienced decades ago when he first stepped onto a concert stage as a young man. ready to share his music with the world. As David stood awkwardly beside the piano bench, still processing the applause and wondering what to do next, a woman in an elegant black dress approached the reception desk. She had been waiting near the restaurant entrance across the street, and had seen the crowd gathering in the hotel lobby through the large windows. Curiosity had gotten the better of her, and she had decided to come inside to see what was happening. The woman was Mrs. Chun, a prominent arts journalist who wrote for several major newspapers and magazines. She had been covering classical music for over 20 years and was in town specifically to write a feature story about tomorrow night's symphony gala. She had planned to interview some of the board members over dinner, but when she saw the unusual scene in the hotel lobby, her journalist instincts kicked in. As she walked closer to the piano area, Mrs. Chun noticed something that made her stop, dead in her tracks. Sitting in the corner armchair, mostly hidden behind the large plant, was a face she recognized immediately. Her heart started beating faster as she realized who she was looking at. "Excuse me," she whispered to the woman standing next to her, a guest who had been part of the impromptu audience. "Do you know who that gentleman is, sitting over there by the plant?" The hotel guest followed Mrs. Chun's gaze and shrugged. "I think he's just another guest. He's been sitting there reading his newspaper for a while. Why?" Mrs. Chun pulled out her phone and quickly searched through her contacts, until she found a photo from last year's international piano competition. She showed the screen to the woman beside her, then pointed back toward the corner chair. "Look at this photo, then look at that man again. Tell me if you see the resemblance." The woman squinted at the phone, then at the elderly gentleman in the corner. Her eyes widened slowly as the recognition dawned on her. "Oh my goodness," she whispered. "Is that really—" "Professor Mikhail Volkov," Mrs. Chun confirmed quietly. "One of the greatest living classical pianists and conductors in the world. He's supposed to be conducting the symphony tomorrow night, but I had no idea he was staying at this hotel." Word began to spread through the crowd like electricity. Mrs. Chun discreetly showed the photo on her phone to a few other people, and soon small groups were whispering excitedly to each other. The businessman who had been tapping his foot impatiently earlier now found himself looking back and forth between David and Professor Volkov with amazement. "Wait, you mean that famous pianist was sitting right there the whole time?" asked the young mother who had been listening with her daughter. "He heard everything?" The elderly retired music teacher who had been the first to applaud suddenly felt his knees go weak. He had spent his entire career teaching students about the great masters of classical music, and Professor Volkov was definitely one of them. The idea that this legendary musician had just witnessed the same performance he had been enjoying made the whole experience feel even more incredible. Near the front desk, one of the receptionists who had been completely absorbed in David's performance suddenly remembered something important. She quickly pulled up the hotel's guest registry on her computer and scrolled through the list of evening arrivals. There it was, a reservation under the name M. Volkov, checked in about an hour ago. She had handled the check-in herself, but hadn't recognized the name at the time. "Oh, no," she whispered to her colleague. "I checked in Professor Volkov earlier, and I had no idea who he was. I just treated him like any other guest." Her colleague looked confused. "Who's Professor Volkov?" The receptionist quickly pulled up a Google search on her computer and showed her coworker some images and articles about the famous musician. "He's incredibly famous in the classical music world. Look at all these awards and achievements. And he was sitting right here in our lobby, listening to David play." The teenagers who had been waiting for the elevator were now huddled around one of their phones, looking up videos of Professor Volkov's performances on YouTube. One of the girls had found a recording of him playing the same Chopin nocturne that David had just performed, and they were amazed by the similarities in musical expression between the two performances. "This is insane," one of the boys said. "That maintenance guy was playing at the same level as one of the world's best pianists, and the actual world-famous pianist was sitting right there watching him." David, meanwhile, was still standing beside the piano, completely unaware of the growing excitement around him. The hotel manager had finally reached him and was speaking in low tones, but his expression wasn't angry like David had feared. Instead, he looked amazed and curious. "That was absolutely incredible," the manager said. "I had no idea we had such talent working right here in our hotel. How long have you been playing piano?" Before David could answer, he noticed that people were looking back and forth between him and something else in the lobby. He followed their gaze and saw the elderly gentleman from the corner chair slowly standing up and smoothing his suit jacket. There was something about the man's presence and the way everyone was looking at him that made David feel like he was missing something important. Mrs. Chun, realizing that this was a once-in-a-lifetime moment, decided to approach David directly. As a journalist, she knew a great story when she saw one, and this situation was extraordinary beyond anything she could have imagined. "Excuse me," she said to David, introducing herself and showing her press credentials. "I'm a music journalist, and I was wondering if you realize who was in your audience tonight." David looked confused. "My audience? I was just playing piano. I didn't think anyone was really paying attention." Mrs. Chun smiled and gestured toward Professor Volkov, who was now walking slowly in their direction. "That gentleman over there is Professor Mikhail Volkov. He's one of the most respected classical musicians in the world. He's conducted orchestras in Vienna, New York, London, everywhere you can imagine. And he was sitting right there listening to every note you played." David's face went completely pale. He had heard of Professor Volkov, of course. Any piano student, even a self-taught one like himself, knew that name. He had watched videos of the professor's performances online and had always dreamed of someday having even a fraction of that level of skill and artistry. "Are you serious?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Professor Volkov was really here, listening to me play?" The crowd around them had grown larger, and everyone seemed to be holding their breath as they watched Professor Volkov approach. Cell phones were appearing everywhere as people began to record. What they sensed was going to be a very special moment. The little girl who had been sitting on the floor during the performance tugged on her mother's dress. "Mommy, why is everyone acting so excited about that old man?" Her mother knelt down and whispered, "That man is very famous for playing piano, sweetheart. It's like if your favorite singer was sitting in our living room while you were singing your favorite song." The child's eyes went wide with understanding. Wow, is the piano man going to be in trouble? David was wondering the same thing. His mind was racing with questions and worries. What would a world-famous musician think of his amateur performance? Had he made mistakes that someone with professional training would immediately notice? Was he about to be embarrassed in front of all these people by someone who actually knew what real piano playing was supposed to sound like? But as Professor Volkov came closer, David could see that the elderly man's face showed no signs of criticism or disapproval. Instead, there was something that looked almost like excitement in his deep blue eyes, and the hint of a warm smile at the corners of his mouth. As the realization spread through the lobby like wildfire, something extraordinary happened. The entire space seemed to freeze in time, as if someone had pressed a pause button on the whole world. Every person in the Grand Central Hotel lobby stood perfectly still, their eyes moving back and forth between David and Professor Volkov, trying to process the incredible situation unfolding before them. The silence was so complete that you could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic from the street outside. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Everyone seemed to understand instinctively that they were witnessing something that would probably never happen again in their lifetimes. Mrs. Chun, the music journalist, had her phone out and was recording, but her hands were actually shaking with excitement. In 20 years of covering the classical music world, she had never seen anything like this. Here was one of the world's most celebrated musicians, someone who had performed for presidents and royalty, approaching a hotel maintenance worker who had just delivered a performance that could have graced any concert hall in the world. The hotel manager stood frozen beside David, his mouth slightly open in amazement. He had been working in hospitality for 15 years and thought he had seen everything. Celebrity guests, unexpected events, strange coincidences, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. He was trying to figure out what his responsibilities were in this situation. Should he intervene? Should he give them privacy? Should he call his boss? Nothing in his training had covered what to do when a world-famous musician encounters hidden talent in your lobby. The businessman who had been impatient about checking in earlier was now completely transfixed. He had put his briefcase down on the floor and was staring at the scene with the same fascination he might have watching a once-in-a-lifetime sporting event. His wife, who had joined him from the restaurant next door after seeing the crowd through the window, was gripping his arm tightly and whispering, "I can't believe we're actually here for this." The young couple, who had been discussing their relationship problems, were now standing hand in hand, both of them realizing that they were part of something much bigger than their personal issues. The music had already brought them closer together, but witnessing this historic moment made them feel like they were sharing something truly special. Years later, they would tell their children and grandchildren about the night they watched a famous pianist discover a hidden musical genius in a hotel lobby. The retired music teacher was perhaps the most affected of all the witnesses. His entire life had been dedicated to nurturing musical talent in young people, but he had never seen raw ability like David's combined with such an incredible coincidence. He was thinking about all the students he had taught over the years, wondering if any of them might have had this level of natural gift if they had just been given the right opportunities and encouragement. Near the elevators, the group of teenagers had gone completely silent. They were used to communicating through social media and text messages, but this moment demanded real, physical presence. One of the girls was live-streaming the scene on her phone, and the comments were pouring in from viewers around the world who couldn't believe what they were seeing. The video was already being shared and reshared, spreading the incredible story far beyond the walls of the hotel lobby. The little girl who had been so enchanted by David's music was now sitting perfectly still on her mother's lap, sensing the importance of the moment even though she didn't fully understand it. Her mother was stroking her hair gently, both of them watching as history unfolded just a few feet away from them. The child would be in her 20s before she truly understood the significance of what she had witnessed that night. Even the hotel staff had stopped all their usual activities. The receptionists had abandoned their computers, the bellhops had set down their luggage carts, and the cleaning crew had paused in their work. Everyone understood that normal hotel operations could wait a few minutes while something extraordinary happened in their workplace. David stood frozen in place, his face a mixture of terror and amazement. Just an hour ago, he had been finishing his normal work shift, thinking about going home to his small apartment and maybe practicing a little on his old electric keyboard. Now he was standing in front of one of his musical heroes, surrounded by a crowd of people who were all looking at him like he was someone special and important. His mind was racing with thoughts and emotions he couldn't even begin to process. Part of him wanted to run away and hide, to escape back to the safety of his normal, predictable life. But another part of him was filled with a hope so intense it was almost painful. Could this really be happening? Could his years of secret practice and private dreams actually lead to something real? Professor Volkov continued his slow approach, and with each step, the tension in the lobby seemed to grow stronger. The professor's face was calm and dignified, but those who knew him well might have noticed the slight sparkle in his eyes that appeared whenever he encountered something that truly excited him musically. As he walked, Professor Volkov was thinking about his own journey as a young musician. He remembered being discovered at age 16 by a teacher who recognized his potential and changed his life forever. He remembered the fear and excitement of those early days when everything seemed possible but also terrifying. Looking at David now, he saw that same mixture of raw talent and overwhelming emotion that had defined his own youth. The professor was also thinking about his responsibility as someone who had been blessed with success and recognition in the music world. He had always believed that talent like David's was a gift that belonged not just to the individual, but to the world. It was his duty to help nurture and develop such rare ability whenever he encountered it. Behind Professor Volkov, other hotel guests were quietly joining the crowd. Word was spreading throughout the building about what was happening in the lobby. People were coming down from their rooms, emerging from the restaurant and bar, gathering to witness what everyone sensed was a life-changing moment. Mrs. Chen was already thinking about the article she would write about this encounter. She knew that by tomorrow morning this story would be picked up by news outlets around the world. The video footage being recorded by dozens of phones would go viral within hours. David's life was about to change in ways he couldn't even imagine. And she was here to document every moment of it. The security guard, who had been watching from near the entrance, slowly walked closer to the piano area. His job was usually to prevent unusual situations from disrupting the hotel's peaceful atmosphere, but he recognized that this was the kind of unusual situation that should be protected and preserved, not stopped. As Professor Volkov came within just a few steps of David, the entire lobby seemed to hold its collective breath. The next few minutes would determine whether this remained simply a beautiful memory or became the beginning of something that would change David's life forever. The moment stretched on, suspended between the ordinary world David had always known and the extraordinary possibilities that seemed to be opening up before him. Everyone watching understood that they were about to witness either the most amazing coincidence of their lives or the birth of a new musical star. Professor Volkov finally reached David and stopped just a few feet away from him. The elderly musician stood there for a moment, studying the young man's face with kind, intelligent eyes. David felt like his heart might actually stop beating. He had watched this man's performances online countless times, had studied his technique and tried to learn from his musical interpretations. And now Professor Volkov was standing right in front of him in person. "Young man," Professor Volkov said finally, his voice carrying a slight accent that made every word sound elegant and important. "May I ask your name?" David's mouth felt completely dry. He tried to speak but only managed a small croak. He cleared his throat and tried again. "David, sir. My name is David." Professor Volkov smiled warmly. "David, a beautiful name." King David, the musician who could calm troubled hearts with his music. He paused, letting that sink in. "I have been sitting in that corner for the past hour, and I must tell you something. In 50 years of performing and teaching music around the world, I have rarely heard such pure, honest musical expression as what you just shared with all of us." The crowd around them seemed to lean in closer, straining to hear every word. Mrs. Chen was recording everything, knowing that this conversation would be replayed millions of times in the coming days. The hotel manager was frantically texting his boss, trying to explain the incredible situation happening in their lobby. David's eyes filled with tears, and he looked down at his feet, overwhelmed by the compliment. I can't believe you're really here, Professor. I've watched your performances online so many times. You're one of my heroes." "And now you are one of mine," Professor Volkov replied gently. "Tell me, David, who was your teacher? Where did you study music?" This was the question David had been dreading. He looked up at the famous musician, his face red with embarrassment. "I don't have a teacher, sir. I taught myself. We couldn't afford lessons when I was growing up, so I learned from library books and YouTube videos. I know it probably shows in my playing. I know I'm not as good as real musicians who had proper training." A murmur of amazement rippled through the crowd. The retired music teacher shook his head in disbelief. The teenagers looked at each other with wide eyes. The idea that someone could play at that level without formal training seemed almost impossible to believe. Professor Volkov's eyebrows raised in genuine surprise. "You are entirely self-taught? Everything I just heard came from your own dedication and natural musical instinct?" David nodded, still not quite able to meet the professor's eyes. "Yes, sir. I work here at the hotel doing maintenance. I've been saving money hoping maybe someday I could take some real lessons, but But what?" Professor Volkov asked gently. "But people like me don't usually get chances like that," David finished quietly. "I know I'm just dreaming too big." "Professor." Volkov was quiet for a long moment, and David was terrified that he had said something wrong. The entire lobby waited in complete silence, watching the interaction between the world-famous musician and the young hotel worker. Finally, Professor Volkov reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, elegant business card. He held it out to David with both hands like he was presenting something precious. David, I want you to listen to me very carefully. What you have is not something that can be taught in any music school. You have a gift that is incredibly rare, something that perhaps one person in a million possesses. David took the card with shaking hands, not daring to look at it yet. Professor Volkov continued, his voice growing more passionate. Technical skill can be learned. Proper finger position, music theory, even stage presence, all of these things can be taught to anyone willing to work hard. But what you have, this ability to make music speak directly to people's hearts, to make them feel something real and beautiful, this cannot be taught. This comes from the soul. The little girl in her mother's arms whispered loudly, "Mommy, why is the famous man being so nice to the piano man?" Her innocent question somehow captured what everyone was thinking. They were witnessing an act of incredible kindness and recognition. "You mentioned that you've been saving money for lessons," Professor Volkov said to David. "Tell me, what is your dream? If anything were possible, what would you want to do with your music?" David looked up at him, tears now flowing freely down his cheeks. I dream about playing for people who really want to listen. I dream about bringing them the same joy that music brings me. But I know that's probably impossible for someone like me." Professor Volkov smiled, and there was something almost magical in his expression. "David, nothing is impossible when you have a gift like yours. Tomorrow morning, I want you to come to the concert hall where we're preparing for tomorrow night's symphony performance. Do you know where that is?" David nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "Good, come at 10 o'clock in the morning. Ask for me at the stage door and show them this card." Professor Volkov pointed to the business card in David's hands. "I want you to play for me and for some of my colleagues. We need to discuss your future." The businessman in the crowd turned to his wife and whispered, "Did you just offer that kid an audition?" His wife nodded, wiping tears from her own eyes. Mrs. Chun was already composing her headline in her mind. "World-renowned pianist discovers hidden genius in hotel lobby." This was going to be the biggest story of her career. David finally looked down at the business card in his hands. It was simple but elegant, with Professor Volkov's name and contact information printed in understated letters. At the bottom, it listed his titles: Principal Conductor, Vienna Philharmonic; Artist in Residence, Juilliard School of Music. "Professor," David said, his voice barely above a whisper, "are you sure? Are you really sure about this?" "I don't want to waste your time." Professor Volkov placed a gentle hand on David's shoulder. "My dear boy, in my entire career, I have never been more sure of anything. You have given me a gift tonight by sharing your music with all of us. Now I want to give you a gift in return, the chance to share that music with the whole world." The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. But this time it was different from the applause after David's performance. This was applause for a moment that had changed everything, for a life that had just been transformed by the simple act of one person. Recognizing another's worth, David looked around at all the faces surrounding him, the hotel guests, the staff members, the teenagers with their phones, the little girl clapping her hands excitedly. Just 2 hours ago, these had all been strangers going about their ordinary evening routines. Now they were all part of his story, witnesses to the moment when his impossible dream suddenly became possible. "Thank you," David said to Professor Volkov, and then to the entire crowd. "Thank you all for listening." Professor Volkov smiled and began to walk back toward his corner chair to collect his newspaper. As he passed Mrs. Chun, he paused briefly. "I trust you will tell this story well," he said to her quietly. "I will, Professor. The whole world is going to know about David by tomorrow." As the crowd began to slowly disperse, people approached David one by one to congratulate him and wish him luck. The hotel manager shook his hand and told him to take tomorrow off work. The retired music teacher gave him some advice about preparing for his audition. The little girl's mother lifted her daughter up so she could give David a high five, but David barely heard any of it. He was staring at the business card in his hands, knowing that his life had just changed forever. Tomorrow morning he would wake up in the same small apartment, but he would no longer be just a hotel maintenance worker with a secret dream. Tomorrow, he would be a musician with a real chance to share his gift with the world.